Well, since I've already introduced myself, I want to let Judy introduce herself.
Yeah, I'm Judy Ledbetter, a longtime volunteer with the Charles City County Richard M. Bowman Center for Local History. Thank you all for being here still. I know it's been a long day and you're probably all ready to go. So we'll try to make this as succinct as we can. It's a very important topic and one that I am pretty passionate about. I started probably at this point at least 12 years ago, creating a database in Charles City that's an enslaved ancestor file. We now have more than 1,000 individuals in the database who have been identified by surname and linked to a plantation or owner. I didn't include that in this, but I'm just going to share with you some of the resources I have found to identify surnames and link enslaved or former owners. One thing I want to, three things I want to say at the outset that I think maybe most of you know, but some may not know. The first is that enslaved people in this area, Charles City in particular, in New Kent, the Tidewater area, were using surnames for many generations. In Charles City, I've traced surnames back to the early 1700s among enslaved communities. So the notion that that they did not have surnames is wrong. They had them, it's just the official records did not recognize those names. That's part of the architecture of slavery. Now I can't even remember the other point I was going to make, but commonly people understand that the 1870 census is the first census in which freedmen are named with their surnames. Prior to that, in the 1850 and 1860 slave censuses, they are listed simply by age, gender, and in some cases by color, as black or mulatto. And then in censuses before 1840, they're in age groups, so it's under 10 or under 15 or between 15 and 25. So those censuses are not especially useful. They can be helpful in some instances, but they aren't. So how do you get beyond the brick wall of 1870? Well, there are a surprisingly number of resources, and every day more are becoming available. It's getting easier and easier to do this kind of research because of the digitization of resources.
And just one more thing I want to say about the 1870, if you will notice on there, a lot of times those who were enslaved are still living near or almost right next to the person who enslaved them. So you'll see that a lot of times.
Now, the records that we're going to go through, and we'll go through them quickly, don't panic, just to show you kind of the wide variety of records that contain information that could be useful to putting together your family story. Now, the first one are marriage licenses. The marriage licenses are probably the singly most important tool you have, because especially the licenses in the period from 1865 to 1875. If you simply rely on the information that's in an index or available online, you're missing a lot of information. So you may want to try to get a copy of the license and or a consent if there is one. Now here are two examples from Charles City. The one on the left, Robert Randolph Carter of Shirley Plantation, says in there that James Washington was born at Shirley in November 1852. Why? Because James Washington maybe didn't have a father or mother to attest to his age, that he was of age. And the enslaver is the one who has all the records. So I found probably probably closer to 20 of these going through the consents, where a former enslaver is attesting to the age of either the male or female who's getting married. In the second one, and I realize you can't read it very well, John or Jack Wallace says in this request that a license be issued, it's not technically consent, that he was born in Westover. Again, establishing where he had been enslaved. And he did that on his own in his consent. Have you seen other things in marriage? Oh, the other thing is, particularly if it's a marriage that takes place, again, as I say, in this 1865 to 1870 time period, you have to see the license itself to know where the marriage took place. And in that instance, if somebody's getting married at Greenway, I know that's a very good chance that they were previously enslaved at Greenway. Not perfect, but that's one. All you do is you marshal these clues, and then together you get enough of them, you can figure out the story. Oops. What am I not doing right? There we go. Okay, the next thing is Freedmen's Bureau records. These have been digitized, but they have not all been indexed on Ancestry. The number of microfilm reels in the Freedmen's Bureau records is a larger number than the entire 1870 census for the United States. That gives you an idea about how huge this record series is. Now they're actually lists of indigent freedmen on the government farms. These are in records that have not yet been indexed, so you have to know which reel to go to in the browse function to find them. They have been published, abstracted and published in a book that we have at the History Center, but one of the things you have to be aware of is the former enslaved are phonetically describing the names of their owners, or enslavers. Yeah. So for example, Dr. Powhatan Stark of Charles City is Potan Stoke. You know, I have to know that Potan Stoke is Powhatan Stark. So there's some of that you have to do in the interpreting it. But in this particular list, there is let me see, I believe it was a Washington owned by Hill Carter, and then there was a Jane O'Four Allen residence in New Kent who'd been enslaved by an Ann Johnson. That's one example of Freedmen's Bureau record. The conditions on the Lower Peninsula, well, in all of the Freedmen's Bureau farms, were so horrific. I mean, they were just death traps. The Bureau, to try to depopulate the Lower Peninsula, finally adopted a policy of transporting freedmen back to the counties where they had been enslaved. So they, for that reason, had to identify former enslavers in the former county of residence. This transportation order indicates that these 4 members of the Hunt family were being transported to Westover Landing with the notation that they would be employed by William A. Harrison of Westbury. Again, that's not absolute proof that they were previously enslaved, but I'll tell you, 95% of the time, that's evidence that was their former enslaver. And the Freedmen's Bureau records don't count the Freedmen's bank records, which are very voluminous as well. And I will warn you that what I saw on Ancestry with a recent post and went through, I only came up with about 9 records where somebody was from Charles City. And I have, from other CD copies we had, I have probably 35 or 40 more. So I don't think all those records that are on Ancestry have been indexed, that's my guess. But you can get a lot of family information from these, as well as sort of diaspora stories. For example, in the first one, Caroline Penniman, this was a bank account in, I don't remember whether it was Alabama or Georgia, but she'd been born in Charles City, so you know from that she's been a victim of the Second Middle Passage. She was sold away from the rest of her family. But she says that her father, William G. of Charles City, is dead. Her mother, Molly, is living in Charles City, so she knows this. She's got some contact with people to know that. William Henry, her brother, supposedly is dead, and her sister, Sibylla Harris, is in Virginia. So you've got all of these, there's no way you would know all of these family members. There's no way without this record that you'd be able to put it together. The second one is Alfred James, who lives in New Kent, has a bank account in the city of Richmond. He is a miller at a sawmill, and he's, let's see, 21. He names his father Nelson, his mother Lavinda, brother Joshua, and three sisters, Frances, Mary, and Martha. In addition, the deposit was made by James D. Allen. So who's James D. Allen? I don't know. Maybe it's the sawmill owner. Maybe it's somebody, a brother-in-law or somebody else. And then in the third one is Rosetta Christian from New Kent, but where's she living? Fort Monroe. And she is 54 years old. Okay, so this is a record in 1872. She's 54. That means she was born, help me, 1818, something like that. And she names her husband, who is deceased, William, the names of her children, Andrew, Joe, Rosetta, and Jane, and the name of her father, Daniel Jackson. Okay, so you're back, basically, you're back before in the 1700s with this one record. And her mother was Dolly Ann, who's deceased, and names two sisters, Laura and Ann.
She was owned by Pat Christian.
Okay.
I remember seeing that on the list.
Okay. Birth registers and death records, registers or certificates, can sometimes help you. If your ancestor was born between 1853, when the birth register system started, and the Civil War, depending on when they stopped recording them. In Charles City, 1861 was the last year. There are no recorded births through 62 or later years. They have all been abstracted and published in a five or six volume series called the Virginia Slave Birth Index. And here you have lists. These are all lists of enslavers with the surname Christian. Now, you will see in them, there will be some where the mother's name is listed, but not the child, simply male, born alive. Or you'll have the child's name, but not the mother's. Or in some cases, you'll just have that it was a male slave, born alive, and the date, but no name of mother or child. So they're very imperfect, but they still can be useful and helpful. And you might find your family that way. Death records, did you have some that you were thinking about? If there's a death, particularly if it's in the 1865 to 1870 time period, and the person reporting the death is listed as a friend, and it's a white person, very commonly those were former enslavers who were reporting the deaths of their now freedmen. The one on the right is a very unusual record. That is the death certificate for Peggy M. Odie, who's buried at Second Liberty, who was 102 when she died in 1936. And where it's supposed to list parents, it says unknown, but it says slaves during the war belonging to Ken Harding, New Kent. It's the only time I've ever seen one like that.
I found two more.
Okay.
That listed with the owner's name.
Yes, but
Are all of these examples available in Ancestry or some other source?
Ancestry has the Virginia Slave Birth Index on it. And the death certificates are also available on Ancestry. Her name is Peggy M. Odie, or Otay, depending on which county you're in, or whether you're white or black, how you pronounce it. The whites pronounce it Odie, the blacks pronounce it Otay. Church records. In fact, the first time I started to encounter a lot of surnames was in the private register of William Lavelle, who was the rector of Westover Church for about 10 or 12 years. And in his private register, and in the parish register also, but a lot of it in his private register, he had no trouble bearing an old servant, no name. But when he baptized a child, they always had a surname because it counted in his records. I kid you not. So I was through those records that I found a number of families, and through the baptismal records. Now here we have. Did you want to talk about the St. Peter's record?
The St. Peter's record. St. Peter's is one of the oldest churches in New Kent County, and they have hundreds of birth records and several death records for enslaved and free blacks also. So this is always a good source for if you research in New Kent County. And I do believe that is online. That's online now,
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
So you can pull that up online and look at the index to it and look for the surnames. And then it will say also, you'll see it says slaves, might be in the index, and Negroes too, I believe is in there. So it is a good source to review.
The record on the right is very, very hard to read, but it is a typescript that Jackie Pomeroy prepared of the records of Charles City Baptist, later Emmaus Church. And that church was and later Second Liberty, was predominantly comprised of enslaved people. It was an integrated church. It had white membership, it had free black membership, and it had enslaved membership. But the largest part of its membership were enslaved people. I counted more than 50 who were from Shirley Plantation, who were members of Charles City Baptist before 1812. And there are New Kent plantations in there as well. There are included in there are some surnames. And one of the more remarkable ones I found on that list is a John Rock or Roach, who was enslaved at Shirley Plantation. That's the name of a white indentured servant who served at Shirley in the late 1600s. And we have this crazy manuscript, or found this crazy manuscript in the back of the Charles City Militia book, which begins with an essay about how this Roach, during the period of his servitude, cohabited with a free black woman and had children by her, and then at the end of his servitude he married a roister and had children by her, and basically the manuscript ends at that point. What it doesn't tell you is he obviously also had a child by an enslaved woman at Shirley, and the name persisted for that's about 5 generations, up to 1812. Okay, U.S. pension records. These are hard to come by because they are not digitally available. The History Center ordered about 40 of them for men from Charles City whose service we documented and knew they were the right pensioner. So we have them, a lot of them for Charles City. The Family History Center associated with the new Slavery Museum that's being built in Charleston, South Carolina, has paid a private contractor to digitize all of the U.S. pension records, USCT pension records. And so they will be available then through that South Carolina museum. But they are absolute gold mines. And these are 2 pension affidavits from the widow's application of Phoebe Ann Harris. And I just want to read you just a little bit of one so you get a flavor of what they have in them. She says, I am in my 77th year. My address is Kimmages, Virginia. I am the widow of Edward Christian. I'm a pensioner. My late husband, Edward Christian, was in the Navy and served on the Wabash. Yes, sir. I'm acquainted with Phoebe Ann Harris, claimant we are first cousins. I have known her from a baby. We lived on the same plantation, that of Hill Carter, at Shirley, Virginia, until the time of the war. Her name before she was married was Phoebe Ann Washington. Her father was Jim Washington. he was in the Navy too. Oh yes, I know William Harris very well. He belonged to William Harrison. He was not grown when I first knew him. He lived about 2 miles from us. Yes, sir, he lived on the Harrison place until he went into the Navy. For I know that he and my late husband, Edward Christian, and my brother Martin Hewlett, now at Bermuda 100, Virginia, and some others all went away together. Look how many names we've gotten so far, okay? Yes, sir. William Harris, my late husband, and Charles Lewis were all in the Navy together. Yes, and my brother Martin too. William Harris was born over on the other side of the river at Blair's in Prince George County. He was serving in the Army. He was never in the Army before he ran away with Ed Christian and the others. Anyway, it goes on and on. But did you see that? I mean, it's a whole family history, not just of her family, but of William Harris, who was owned by William S. Harrison, who had been a miner. He inherited land and enslaved people in Prince George. He bought Westbury, and brought his slaves from Blair's to Westbury. But she knows this whole history of this man who is married to her cousin. Anyway, they are fabulous resources as well. Okay, you want to talk about these?
Deeds, wills, and chancery cases. Now, these are a couple that are from New Kent County. Now, this one is in the deed book, this guy is leaving this property, which includes slaves in there. He's leaving it to his son because he's left some money to someone. So if that money is not paid back until after he dies, then the son gets what's listed in here. And of course, it lists the property, but it also lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slaves in there. So you got 5 names of slaves. So it's very, very good for you to go to all the courthouses, especially the old ones. And the ones that do have records that haven't burned, they will go back further. So you can find a lot of names in there. Now this one here is a will. And you can't see that too well. But basically, he is stating what he's leaving in his will. And he is leaving, I think it's 20-some slaves. What he's doing, he's dividing a certain amount to his wife, and then he's leaving some to his children. So he does that, of course, their first name, but it still will give you a leave to go on. So make sure you always look for any deeds, any will, or transfer cases that you find. And of course, the transfer cases are online. Library of Virginia has those online.
And the chancery cases, you can search for enslaved people. You have to put in a name at a minimum, but like I can do Charles City and Moses, and I will get every chancery case that has Moses in it. So it's only, I find it helpful if you have an unusual name or a less common name. If you have a name like Granville, it's great because there's only going to be one Granville. And you find him in a chancery record, you know it's your Granville. And a lot of these records, I'm amazed at how fast some of this stuff is going online. Family Search, I think, is the one who's digitizing them, but I just found yesterday Charles City Will Book #1 is on Ancestry now. So it's worth checking on a regular basis to see what records have been digitized.
Private papers. It is very important that you look for any private papers, which might also include account books or diaries. Now, this is one that I was doing for my research in my family here. I found the owner of my great-grandmother, and I also knew a descendant of the person that enslaved them. So he owns Cook's Mill. There was a Cook's Mill on Cook's Mill Road in New Kent County. I know the person that was, she's his great-great-granddaughter. So I called and asked her, by any chance, did the family have any account books or diaries? So I told her my great-grandmother's name, which was Martha Emily Page up here, and her mother was named Betsy Page. She did check with her mom, and mom had 3 books. One of them, he listed his previous male slaves and previous female slaves, because this was done in 1866. So these are all the slaves that he owned at that time. Not only was my great-grandmother in there, but 1, 2, 3, 4 of her sisters were listed along with the mother. And I had no idea of 2 of the names of sisters. Also in his diary, he listed 2 of my great-grandmother's brothers dying very young. And he gives in detail that he paid $1 for a coffin to bury the little black children. So I got quite an information out of that diary book, and I thought I would never find anything on my grandmother, because she died young. My grandfather never talked about it, of course my dad didn't know her. So private papers, diaries, and account books will give you a lot of information, so make sure you look for them.
At the History Center, we have on microfilm the Shirley Plantation records, which are 24 reels of microfilm. We have the Jerdone family papers, which are about Sterling Plantation, that's probably a dozen. We have the Fielding Lewis papers, which were for Wyandotte, and we have the Major Marable family papers. So we have a lot of those plantation records on microfilm at the History Center. This one on the left is a part of what's called a meat list, a provisions list from Shirley Plantation. And these are households. So the first one is Ginny, is listed as sort of the head of the household. All those are all the members of her house, most of them family members. It's Ginny Washington. Her husband had just died. And the next one is Joe Buck and the members of his family. The next one is Mary Ann with George, who's George Moore. I know basically all of these at this point by surname. Tom Howe is Tom Howard, Jim Green. But you see there are a number of surnames that Carter used that were the family surnames that he used in his own records. But I did find interestingly that there were at least 3 families that when it came to public records, in other words, when they were giving their own names, they gave different surnames than the ones he used in the records. And I think it was probably he chose to call them by the mother's name rather than the father's name for whatever reasons, to distinguish family groups, or maybe he just didn't know what surnames they claimed for themselves. But there are some very interesting kind of naming patterns that I've observed at Shirley Plantation. And tax list. The war from New Kent, and you told me it was a tax list, right?
Yes, that's the last year of Civil War, which is 1865. The person that enslaved them still had to pay the taxes. So this is a list that's dated January the 12th, which means they paid the taxes for the year of 1865. So it's a whole list, and what it does, it lists the person who was enslaved, and then over here, it will list the owner's name. So you know exactly who. And this was only for, came from Library, Virginia, is where it is.
It's among the New Kent County newspapers. Now, the one on the right, I told you the earlier censuses and tax lists, just people categorized. Well, the very earliest ones, 1782, 83, 84, first few, name everybody. And someone told me, maybe you could, Greg, tell us whether this is right or not, that it was actually a militia list. Have you ever heard that?
No.
Okay, that was a new one for me. But anyway, this is the list for Charles Carter, Shirley Plantation. And one of the things that I know from all the time I've spent studying it, that's a surname, Tin. That's a surname that persists at Shirley. And there are a number of other surnames. I think the second one up there is Buck. That's a surname. Anyway, there's still information that you can learn from these lists back as far as 1784. These are much rarer records, but this is something that the History Center recently acquired. It's a little account book in which a store owner kept track of the credit he had extended to enslaved people by the plantation. So at the top, again, it's very hard to read. It says Clark's, which was John Clark, who owned Broomfield. And on the other side, it's Westover. And all those are individuals who were enslaved by John Selden at Westover. And there's one, for example, the Burrell Carter. That's the first time I was ever able to put the surname Carter with Burrell, was from this record of a debt he owed. And finally, we're at the end. Newspaper advertisements. There is a website called Last Seen Finding Family After Slavery, and it's been collecting these advertisements from papers all over the country and transcribing them. The one on the left this was an ad placed by Emanuel Quivers Jr. trying to find relatives of his aunt in Richmond, and mentions that her son Stephen was postmaster after the Civil War, that he was in California, and he was trying to locate these family members who he learned about from his father and mother. The other one is one of several ads placed by Clara Bishop or Bishop, trying to find a daughter, Patience Green. And she says, I have no trace of her since she was sold in Richmond in 1859. She was then 12 years old. I also desire information regarding the whereabouts of my son, John William Harris. He went to Washington after Lee's surrender with some servants of Mr. Batts, who lived in Prince George County. He was 14 years old at the time. They were both formerly slaves of Dick Christian, by whom my daughter was sold. Any tidings of either will be thankfully received by their mother, Miss Clara Bishop. Dick Christian that she refers to was our clerk of court, Robert Christian, who owned the courthouse plantation. And the house next to Cole's Courthouse Grill was rebuilt after the war, basically on the foundations of his old plantation house. We've gone through this quickly, and I've approached it somewhat cavalierly in that this is an incredibly painful and difficult search for many people. And you have to be prepared in this to find things that are very discomforting. And so I'm going to end today with something that is incredibly painful, but I think it's appropriate to the subject. And it's about Clara Bishop. An article was published in New York after this ad had been placed, entitled Hunting Her Child, a former slave still in search of her lost daughter, New York. For 33 years, Ms. Clara Bishop of Morristown, New Jersey, has been searching for her lost daughter, and she is still searching. Tears have often flowed over the woes of Uncle Tom, but her story is sadder and more pathetic than the one Mrs. Stowe so freely told. Mrs. Bishop is tall and slender, and her sad face shows the refinement which the colored women in the aristocratic old families of the South so often possessed. At the Colbath House in Morristown, she is in charge of one of the most important departments. Mrs. Bishop belonged to Dick Christian, a wealthy country gentleman who lived near Charles City Courthouse. Mr. Christian became involved in debt, and his slaves were placed on the block. Among them were Mrs. Bishop and her 12-year-old daughter, Patience. She was a bright little girl, said Mrs. Bishop yesterday. And when we were taken to the marketplace to be sold, I prayed that wherever we might go, we would go together. But her wish was not to be fulfilled. She was sold first, and Ben Davis, a professional Negro trader, bought her. The little girl was sold to a stranger. Mrs. Bishop fell on her knees before Davis and implored him to buy her daughter from the stranger. Though hardened by the constant sight of such scenes, Davis' heart was touched by the agony of the mother. He went to the stranger and offered to buy the little girl. but the latter refused to sell her and went away a few hours later with his Persian. Mrs. Bashop has never seen her daughter since, but her own history since then shows how faithful is a mother's heart, even though it beats in the humble bosom of a slave. Mrs. Bashop was carried to Charleston, South Carolina, and sold again. It was in 1859, and already the rumblings of the coming war were heard. Slaves changed masters rapidly then, and Mrs. Bashop was sold from one to another, passing from Alabama and Mississippi, and being owned at Carrollton in the latter state when emancipation came. But during all her involuntary wanderings, she had no thought but of her lost daughter, Patience. She begged each master to write back to Charles City Courthouse, Virginia, and endeavored to discover something of her. Some complied, others did not, but no news ever came of the missing girl. When she was free, Mrs. Bashop began the search on her own account. For a long time, she could not get away from Mississippi. She could earn but little money, not enough to take her back to Virginia, where her daughter had been sold. But she wrote letters, and friends wrote others for her. At last, she saved money enough to reach Virginia, but the visit increased only her sorrow. Her former master was dead, and the war had swept away old landmarks and old recollections. No one knew anything of her daughter. She could not learn the name of the man who bought her, but her mother's heart was faithful still. She sewed and she cooked. She did housework. She denied herself to save money for her search. She traveled through Virginia. She went through Kentucky. She visited South Carolina and the far south, and everywhere she hunted for her daughter. She put advertisements in the papers. She paid the colored preachers to state the case in their churches before their congregations in order that one person might tell the story to another and thus spread it through the country. But still, no news came of the lost girl. Did you ever, might have come north before the war, and she renewed her search in New York. She found a home where for many months she hunted through the great city. She repeated her advertisements in the newspapers, and she asked the colored preachers here, as she had in the South, to help her, and still no news came of the lost girl. Though 20 years had now gone, the mother was as faithful to her child's memory as ever and searched for her as eagerly and as patiently as she did when she first was free. Finally, she settled in Morristown and has for many years been employed at the Coal Black House, where she intends to remain, but she is still searching for the lost girl.
Those of you who are researching slave, it's not impossible. The only thing I will tell you, it will take time. So you do need to have the time and patience. Because my great-grandmother took me 8 years to find out. So it does take time. So don't give up. It can be done. And I am starting to do something similar to what Judith's doing for Charles City. I am transcribing slave records for New Kent County. We, of course, like to say, we're Bern County, so have to kind of pull in all different areas. But hopefully I'll be able to pull up a large collection of slave records for New Kent County so that it will be in one place. So people who are trades in slave records in New Kent will be able to come to one location and get the information they need, hopefully.
When you first started doing your genealogy, did you do your ancestry first?
No.
No?
No, I started mine before ancestry. You start getting all this stuff. Actually, I started with my family.
Okay.
Because my mother had been sick for many, many years and I was taking care of her. So I just started sitting down when I go down there. I started talking to my dad and mom about their families, and I gathered all the information I could from them. And then because they were all from here, I used to come up here and go to where I am now in the New Kent Historical Society. I used to come to that little old jail and do research in there. That's how I started. Then, of course, when Ancestry did get on, I did immediately get on Ancestry.
Was that helpful to you?
Yes.
Did you do the kit?
A couple of days ago I did kit. My thing is, now I have, like I said, I do have slaves in my family, but I do also have free people. And my free people go back to the late 1600s, which I've been able to go back that far. So for me, the Historical Society, I was able to get a lot of information because of that free side. They had very little on the slavery side. And that's why I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make sure there's information on the slaves in New Kent County because they have neglected that and it needs to be done. But ancestry, yes, is good, and it is good to do the test too. Yeah, it can help you a whole lot.
I think anybody who's worked much with Ancestry knows that there are all sorts of family trees out there that are completely screwy.
Yeah.
You know, people just copy and paste, and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
need to do your own work
Yes.
and document your own connections to be sure about that. But the DNA stuff can be just really marvelous at filling in gaps and making connections. And I'll just give one example. I was contacted, I got an email probably 10, 15 years ago from a woman in Australia who had an ancestor supposedly born in Richmond, Virginia, and she paid a professional genealogist who couldn't come up with anything. And the minute I saw the name, I knew who it was. It was Watt Only, who was not white, and she is white. But she descended from a merchant seaman who jumped ship from a British freighter in Melbourne, Australia in 1859. And I did a whole lot of research for her because she couldn't, you know, from Australia, she can't do it. She'd already paid somebody to try to get the information for her. And it was just this fascinating family that descended from a woman who was enslaved at Colesville Plantation and emancipated under a will by which her children were also to come free. She's one of the ones who petitioned the General Assembly for permission to remain in Virginia, because this was after 1806, was turned down by the General Assembly for a year until her husband would be free under the will of Edward Folks. So that's how, and Watt Only was emancipated by Edward Folks. Betsy Green was emancipated by John Clark at Colesville. And she was turned down by the General Assembly. She was purportedly sold back into slavery in Charles City. But then there seemed to be these three, I call them three lost boys. And nobody could register. We have all these illegals in Charles City. They're people who've been emancipated, haven't left the state, they can't get free Negro certificates, and they're living in jeopardy. And there are lots of them. And the court will, every 10 years or so, issue presentments against them all, and then it'll null process. It'll just throw out the prosecution. So I don't know what sort of system of control that was, or whether it was, you know, just to let us look like we're enforcing the law, when we really aren't. We have no intention to. But anyway, these three lost boys included this woman's great-grandfather who jumped ship in Melbourne, Australia. Well, eventually, she and I together, I surmised that one of the brothers ended up in Boston, Massachusetts. Another ended up in Jacksonville, Florida, built a large construction company. He was the father of a very prominent black dentist in Washington, D.C. Watt Only was also the father of all of the Whiteheads in Charles City, who came from a white woman, Mary Polly Whitehead. Anyway, eventually we learned, and she found some of them, all three of those men ended up as merchant seamen. That was their ticket out. They managed to get to Philadelphia, they got merchant seaman certificates, they got on vessels, and they were basically free men that way. And, well, they were free, but they weren't free in Virginia. They were in jeopardy. And one ended up in Australia, one in Jacksonville, Florida, one in New York. And then I found a record where the one in New York went to Jacksonville to die. So I was confirmed, I know he's a brother. And then through DNA, she has connected with descendants of all the Whiteheads. She's connected with descendants of the Jacksonville brother. So it's this family, you know, that now stretches from Australia to Charles City, to Jacksonville, to New York. Yeah.
One quick question, was she a descendant, or does she have descendants in Charles City as well, the Whiteheads?
No, her family, When her great-grandfather married a white Australian woman, and the entire family has identified as white, but her DNA shows she's got African and Indian ancestry. Yeah.
Yes.
I just wait. No, go ahead.
Okay, well, I want to find, because the information that's here seems to be geared more to Virginia. What would I do if I'm trying to find, because I've hit a brick wall with my ancestry. Our surnames are Dubois and Deschamps. And I know my family is somewhere from Louisiana. So I need to know, now that I've hit that brick wall, I know what the surnames are. I don't know where to go from there because I can't seem to find anything. And the other piece of this also is because people don't spell the names correctly. So that is now, I think, where I'm hitting the brick wall, because Dubois is spelled so many different ways. Deschamps is spelled D-E-C-H-A-M-P-S, but it's D-E-S-C-H-A-M-P-S. So we're looking all over the place, and so I've just hit a brick wall. I don't know what to do now.
How far back have you gone?
Louisiana?
That's what we're trying to find out. You know that they somewhere along the line.
How far back have you
Well,
gone?
one of the problems with other states, particularly with Louisiana, is the records some of them are completely different.
Yeah.
Like there are these notarial archives that
Right.
actually show people
Right.
coming in who have been in the slave trade, for instance, which you don't find in almost any other state. So it's really very localized. I just want to make that point.
I may have somebody that might be able to help you. He's gonna come up in a few minutes, so you might want to talk to him. So I'm gonna hold that until he comes up and introduces himself.
Okay.
You have a question?
No, well, really just more of a comment, and that is, Ancestry is great, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And so is Family Search, and to your point, the General Assembly passed a law a couple years ago that finally told every Family Search, all this film that you have that is digitized, you can now release it. Basically, the clerks had really prevented this from happening in the past, the county clerks.
Oh.
And GA is basically opening it up. That's why you're seeing all those new records
Oh, that's why.
coming out. So that was like that. But I really would say, do go to these places. You know, at the library, you see these millions of pages from chancery courts that we mounted. That's a drop in the bucket compared to all the records we actually have.
Right.
So you go. Not only do go to because there's more records, but two, we have people working there who've been doing this for 25 years, and they can really help guide your research. So don't, a lot of people just say, oh, just go on Ancestry, everything's there. It's not. That's all. Just want to make that point.
Any other questions?